Ms. Fairbanks crossed the gravel at a clip, built for hallways, not farmyards, her heels finding purchase anyway. A folded run sheet already snapping open in one hand before she'd stopped walking. She didn't slow at the little cluster of farmhands. She didn't slow for the old man standing off to the side of the equipment barn's mouth, one shoulder canted lower than the other, watching her come. "You can wait by the truck," she said, not quite to him, more to the air where he happened to be standing, and kept walking toward the barn door, where a lean, sable and black shape held the threshold like it had grown there. 6 days. The dog had not left that spot in 6 days. He had not eaten more than a handful of kibble in 6 days, had not let a single soul closer than 4 feet of the doorframe in 6 days, and the farmhands who'd found it funny on day 1 weren't laughing anymore, not even Devon Sawyer, who stood now with his county extension badge clipped crooked and his arms folded like he was holding himself together. 9 days remained before Westbrook Ag Assurance closed its countywide underwriting renewal at Millrace Crossing, and one line on Ms. Fairbanks's 12-point sheet: structural integrity, load-bearing elements, pass or fail, no middle box provided, stood between this barn and every other barn in the county, and whatever came next. If you have ever watched an animal refuse to move for a reason no one else could see, and felt in your gut that the animal was the one who understood something the rest of the room didn't, sit with that feeling. This story asks you to keep it close. The dog's name was Flint, and he did not growl at Ms. Fairbanks so much as he simply became more still. A held note with teeth behind it, and she wrote something on her sheet without looking up. "That animal is a liability," she said. "To no one. To everyone. I've got 4 more barns before lunch." Cyrus Dabney said nothing at all. He had learned, 74 years deep into a life that had asked him to be quiet more often than loud, that the men and women in the biggest hurry were rarely worth interrupting, and that the ones worth listening to were usually standing very still at the edge of a room, the way he was standing now, coveralls faded, a stitched name long out of business, still legible over his heart, watching a dog nobody else could read, hold a line nobody else could see. The coveralls had a cooperative's name stitched crooked over the breast pocket, a grain concern that had folded before some of the farmhands watching him were born, and Cyrus kept them pressed anyway, because a thing didn't stop being worth keeping clean just because the company behind it was gone. His left shoulder rode low, wouldn't climb past his own collarbone without a wince he'd long since stopped showing, so that every task he did followed an order only he seemed to notice. Reach low first, brace the elbow, then rise. He did it now, crouching to set down nothing at all, just settling his weight the way the shoulder required, and watched Flint watch the barn door like the door itself might move. 3 years now, Flint had lived on the Dabney place. He'd come by way of Cyrus's late son-in-law's unit, a Malinois trained to decoy and detect, and to trust exactly as many people as his handlers told him to trust. And when the discharge paperwork finally cleared, somebody had to take him, and somebody had been Cyrus, who understood dogs that had done real work and had nowhere left to put it. Marisol Dabney had been the one to drive him home from the transfer point, 29 years old with her father's stubborn jaw and her grandfather's patience for paperwork, and she still kept the framed intake form in a drawer in the tenant house where she did the farm's books every evening after supper. She brought supper up to the main house most nights, same as she had for 3 years, setting a plate at Cyrus's elbow without asking if he wanted it, the way you'd set feed out for stock that had never once failed to be hungry. Tonight she watched him through the kitchen window instead, plate warming under a towel, while he carried a shallow pan of water and a folded feed sack out toward the barn door. The fold turned 2 inches narrower than it had been in summer, because the nights had started running cold. He set both down at the exact spot Flint had claimed, not 1 foot closer, not 1 foot farther, the way he'd set them every evening of the 6 days running, and he did not try to touch the dog, and the dog did not try to stop him. In his truck door, in the pocket meant for maps nobody used anymore, there was a stick of pale hand-planed wood, as long as his forearm, its shaft notched every half-inch, with marks only he could read anymore, cut 50 years ago by his own knife, for a purpose no digital sensor in the barn had ever quite replaced. He didn't touch that either, not tonight. He only opened the truck door, looked at it lying there in its groove of worn upholstery, and closed the door again. By the second morning of the formal inspection, Ms. Fairbanks had moved through 9 of her 12 points with the flat competence of someone who had genuinely earned her clipboard-free authority, calling out grain moisture logs, checking the seating on the elevator leg, running a gloved hand along a conveyor belt seam, and catching, correctly, a fraying tension roller that a lesser eye would have missed entirely. She was good at this. Cyrus watched her work and knew it inside the first hour, the way you know a horse, by how it takes offense rather than by how it stands in the yard. It was the 10th point that stopped everything: load-bearing structural elements, visual and instrument inspection, pass or fail. "Ma'am," Cyrus said, and it cost him nothing to say it plain, "that dog isn't guarding a smell, he's guarding a sound." He nodded once toward the second post from the east wall, the only economy of gesture his shoulder allowed. "You'd do well to listen before you write that line." She looked at him the way you'd look at a weather saying stitched on a dish towel, something quaint hung on a wall for atmosphere and not for use. "I have a moisture meter, a load reading from the county's own file, and 40 minutes before my next stop," she said. "I don't have a line item for a dog's feelings, Mr. Dabney, and I don't have one for a stick either." She'd seen the gauge riding in his truck door on her walk-in, and her mouth had done something small and amused about it. Folklore's a fine thing to keep in a truck. It doesn't go on a report. Devon Sawyer, hovering near the doorway with his badge still crooked, wanted to believe the old man. He wanted it enough that he crouched by Flint's water pan afterward and turned over a different theory instead, quieter, more comfortable, old grain dust maybe, settled deep in the doorframe boards, working on some raw patch in the dog's nose that no one else could smell. It was a kind guess. It was also wrong, and something in the way Flint's growl rose and fell, not steady, not blind, but pitched, almost measured, told Devon, if he'd let it, that dust didn't explain rhythm like that. Cyrus let it go. Ms. Fairbanks moved on to her 11th point. The morning went on without him. He spent the next full day not arguing with anyone at all. He brought a folding chair out past the water pan, out of Flint's 4-foot line, and he sat, and he listened, and every hour or so he rose in his fixed order. Low, brace, rise, crossed to a different section of barn wall, and laid the flat of his palm against it without a word, the way another man might check a horse's leg for heat. He worked the wall in a sequence he never varied: east corner post, the seam where the siding met the foundation, the header above the side door, and back again, always in that order, always with the same unhurried patience, while Flint's growl climbed a half-step or dropped a half-step, depending on where Cyrus stood, and Cyrus's face gave away nothing at all, except that he was listening harder than he was looking. The farmhands who had laughed on the first day, who had called it an old man's superstition and a dog gone soft in the head, stopped laughing sometime, around the 4th hour of that day, when they noticed the pattern he was noticing, even without understanding it. Nobody said anything. The gravel lot went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet since Miss Fairbanks's truck first pulled in. Toward evening he sat on his own truck's tailgate, boots not quite touching the ground, and took the gauge stick out of the door pocket and held it across both knees without lifting it to test anything at all. He turned it once in the low light, ran his thumb along a notch, worn smoother than the others, and set it back down beside him, and for a while he simply looked at the barn, the way a man looks at a house he grew up in, from across a road he no longer has any reason to cross. The next morning he stood at the second post from the east wall with Miss Fairbanks and the gathered crowd behind him, and he laid his open palm flat against the timber, low, the way his shoulder required, and waited while Flint's growl climbed to the exact register it had held every time Cyrus's hand found this one spot and no other. He tapped it twice with 2 knuckles, listened to what came back, tapped the post beside it for comparison, listened again. "This post's gone soft 2 feet up from the base," he said. "Somebody swapped grade a good while back, and your sheet's got no line for a thing that was never supposed to happen in the first place." Ms. Fairbanks's pen stopped moving. She looked down at her own report, the one she had already certified, the one already sitting in a folder at the regional office, with her signature dried onto it, and her hand, holding that folded sheet, began refolding it along its crease again and again, a small automatic motion she did not seem to notice she was doing, as if creasing the paper harder might change the words printed on it. Flint wasn't guarding the barn from something coming in, he was guarding Cyrus from something already there. Devon Sawyer, watching the crowd's stillness and the assessor's hands, decided this was the moment to fix things, and in trying to fix them, he made them worse. He put in a call that same afternoon for a rush structural engineer's visit, paid out of his own pocket and his own good intentions, certain that an independent verdict would settle the matter inside a day. The engineer came within 48 hours, walked the barn with instruments Cyrus had never needed, tapped the same post with a rubber mallet and a decibel meter, and found nothing his equipment was built to find, because the false brace behind the siding had been cut and fitted with enough craft to read as sound to anything that couldn't listen the way Flint could. Westbrook's own procedure took the engineer's inconclusive reading and did what procedure does. It triggered a temporary condemnation notice on the entire barn, sealing the grain floor 9 days before harvest transport was due, and forbidding anyone, Cyrus included, from opening so much as a seam of siding without a permit the county wasn't set to issue before the underwriting deadline closed. Marisol Dabney sat that evening with the farm's ledger open on the tenant house table and did not touch her pen for a long while. Her lease on the tenant house ran through the same Westbrook policy, now hanging by the same thread as the barn. So did the farm's operating line of credit, renewed every year on the same signature, at the same office, on the same 9-day clock. A condemned barn on a failed inspection wasn't just a locked door. It was a number that could unravel every other number she kept. Devon had made one more call before the engineer's report ever came back, a call he made out of something closer to desperation than confidence, to a name he'd found buried in an old regional roster. Otis Sedgwick, retired Command Sergeant Major, now running the state's program for retired military working dogs. Sedgwick arrived on the 7th day of the barn's silence, stepping out of a government sedan that looked out of place among the farm trucks, and he did not go first to Ms. Fairbanks, and he did not go first to the condemnation notice taped yellow against the barn door. He went to Flint, crouched at a respectful distance, read the faded tattoo number inside the dog's ear, the way another man might read a name on a headstone, and then he looked up and across the yard, to where Cyrus stood in his fixed, careful way, and something in Sedgwick's face went very quiet. He didn't call him sir, he said a designation instead, an old one that hadn't been used in decades, said it plainly into the open yard, and then he stood there and waited to be corrected, and no one corrected him, because it was true. Rather than simply vouching for the old man in front of the assessor, which would have cost him nothing, Sedgwick spent the better part of that day and the next on the phone and on back roads, tracking down the county's previous barn inspector, a man retired 11 years and living 2 counties over, and what he found cost him something visible. He came back to the Dabney yard with his jaw set, and his color changed, because the retired inspector was not merely careless. He had been, for the better part of 2 decades, the quiet business partner of the same contractor who'd substituted the lumber grade on Cyrus's post, the 2 of them splitting the difference on at least 4 other barns across the county, all still standing, all still unopened, all still certified sound on paper that had never once been walked. I trained men who came home because your fieldcraft told them where the ground would hold and where it wouldn't, Sedgwick said, and it was the only thing close to a speech he allowed himself, and even that came out plain, unadorned, a man handing over a debt rather than making a toast. He carried, from the trunk of his sedan, a battered folder of his own, the retired dog program's emergency reinspection authority, and set it on the tailgate in front of Cyrus, rather than in front of Miss Fairbanks, the permit inside it enough to override, for 1 day only, the condemnation's ban on opening the wall. They opened the false brace the next morning with the whole gathered crowd behind them, and Miss Fairbanks standing closest of all, her folded run sheet finally still in her hand. Behind the cut lumber, Taped flat and yellowed but legible was a grading stamp dated 1974, the correct grade, the correct mill, and beneath it, in a hand Cyrus recognized before anyone told him whose it was, his own initials, penciled by a young man barely into his 20s who had specified that very timber as a contractor's apprentice on this very barn, decades before any uniform, any rank, any discharge. The fraud hadn't just cut a corner. It had quietly replaced Cyrus's own early work, papered over a young man's honest specification with something cheaper, and called it the same thing. Flint rose from the threshold on his own, no command given, and walked 3 slow circles in the yard before folding down in the sun beside the water pan, and did not go back to the doorway. Miss Fairbanks did not apologize in any of the ways people usually imagine apologies. She stood over the open wall for a long moment, then folded her run sheet one final time and put it away in her jacket, and when she spoke, it was to ask, not to explain. "What do you want done?" she said to Cyrus, and meant it as a real question. "Check the other 4 before anybody signs a renewal," he said. "That's the whole of it." Weeks later, the barn stood re-braced, its new post seated true, its grain floor reopened 3 days ahead of the harvest transport it had nearly missed, and on a folding table at the Millrace Crossing elevator office, a revised county run sheet made its way into a new inspector's hands, a 13th line added in Ms. Fairbanks's own writing. Mandatory tap test on load-bearing timber, no name credited, though everyone in that office by then knew whose hands had written the line into being. Cyrus came out to the barn that evening the way he came out every evening now, low, brace, rise, and set nothing down at the doorway at all, because there was nothing left there needing tending. He laid the gauge stick instead flat across the top of the new post, its old notches catching what was left of the light, and behind him, in the doorway he no longer needed to hold, Flint lay stretched loose-limbed across the threshold, finally asleep, finally at rest, and it is a truth this county will carry longer than any signed report will, that the knowledge which keeps a place standing is rarely the kind that ever makes it onto paper, and it outlasts, every time, the paperwork that forgets who built it.